Welcome back to the Whole Bible series. This week we are in the book of Esther. So Esther is part of the writings in the Tanakh. In our Bible, Esther is the last of the Old Testament historical books. It tells us of the events of Yahweh using Esther to preserve the Jewish peoples within the Persian kingdom, and it also explains the importance of a Jewish festival that is added to those already mandated through the law of Moses. For more questions, please go back to episode 10. Esther is the 17th book of the Bible. Hebrew tradition holds that Esther is written by Mordecai, although the text gives no clue as to its author. Linguistics, however, indicate that the book was possibly written sometime in the mid-3rd century BC. For more information, again, go back to episode 10. So Esther is broken down into 4 sections. And here we are on the timeline. So we just finished Ezra and Nehemiah, which is over here on the right from 539 to 424 BC. Esther takes place pretty much smack dab in the middle of that. And so Esther takes place approximately from 485 to 473 BC, right in the middle of what's going on with Ezra, or in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So where we left off last week with Ezra and Nehemiah, Zerubbabel had come in and rebuilt the temple, but God's presence did not return. Ezra came and led the rebuilding of the altar. Nehemiah came and led the rebuilding of the walls and governed Jerusalem well. He governed the people, and Ezra taught the people. And while the Jews were back in the land, they were still not an autonomous people. They were ruled by other nations. And this continued all the way through the time of Jesus. But the majority of the people are now back in the land at the end of Ezra and Nehemiah, and they are moving forward and trying to reestablish their worship of Yahweh. And so we come to the book of Esther, again, taking place in the middle of Ezra and Nehemiah. So here we go with the first section, Esther chapter 1 and 2. So you notice here before we start, we're going to hit on it here in just a second, but Xerxes is the king that is accepted by the scholars as the king referred to in the book of Esther. He reigned from 485 to 465 BC. And so if you look here at the timeline here at the bottom, that puts us right square in the middle between the time that Zerubbabel came back to Jerusalem and the time that Ezra comes back. So in between those two times is when this is taking place. So let's start with chapter 1. Now in the day of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign. So this puts us around 483 to 482 BC. He gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So he has a feast and a celebration that lasts half a year. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. While there were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And the drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So here at the end of these 180 days of parades and pomp and all that, the king gives a feast that lasts 7 days, and we see here that the queen also gives a feast for the women in the palace. So this would be talking about the king's wives and his concubines. So the women belonging to the king, the queen hosted a feast for them as well. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. So he commands the queen to come because he wants to show her off. And then we get to verse 12. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti? Because she has not performed the command of the king Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and of the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let an order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never to come before the king Ahasuerus. And let the king give her give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all the kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. So just a note here, kings in the ancient Near East typically had multiple wives and multiple concubines. However, only one of those wives would be queen. And so here, Vashti, who is his queen, is now banished from the king's presence. So she's demoted from her office as queen, but she does not lose her legal status as a wife. So she's sent back to live with the wives in the housing that is set aside for the women that belong to the king. But she doesn't lose her legal status as a wife. She doesn't become a concubine. She doesn't get kicked out. And this is truly a blessing for her at this point, because the king could have easily had her killed for disobeying him. Just note here on concubines. Concubines were actually viewed as secondary to wives. So don't think so much that they're prostitutes, rather they're a secondary wife. So they would have relations with the king when he called on them, but they would have no legal status as a wife. So they couldn't inherit things. Their children would actually belong to the king's wives rather than to the concubines. So that's what's meant there by no legal status. Chapter 2. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. So here, the men come and they trying to cheer the king up, it seems, and so they say, let an edict be put out through all 127 nations, and let's pull the most beautiful virgins from each uh, territory, and let's bring them back to become the property of the king. And then the king can then adopt them as concubines or wives as he chooses. And from those that come, one of them will be made the queen. Verse 5. There was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai. So this is actually somebody working at the enclosed city. So in the area of the palace, but within the closed city, named Mordecai. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle. So this is Mordecai's cousin, his younger cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and edicts were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa the citadel, in the custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. So it seems here from what's written that somebody that works for the king sees Esther or knows of Esther, and she's beautiful. And so he goes and brings her into the citadel, into the king's palace. But obviously Mordecai knew that this was happening because he told her not to say anything about her heritage. Verse 12. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into the king Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was a regular period for their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So let's pause there real quick. So these young women are brought in, these young virgins are brought in, and they're all placed together in one house. And they're taken care of by a particular eunuch named, let's go back real quick, Haggai. So Haggai the eunuch takes care of the virgins in a particular house. And then after they go and spend a night with the king, they go off to another house, to what is called here a second harem, and they're in charge, or excuse me, there's another eunuch in charge named Shashgaz. Shashgaz is in charge of this second house. So this is after the women had slept with the king, they would go live in this other house. And then from there, depending on how much the king liked them, they would then become either concubines or wives. And but they may not see the king again. Only if the king wanted them to come see him again, he would call them. Otherwise, they would just live in this house for the rest of their lives. Let's get to verse 15. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had the charge of women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to the king, Ahasuerus, into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, so this fast forwards a little bit, now we're in the years of 479 to 48 or 78 BC. Verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted the remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. There's a note here from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. Esther was not in a beauty contest simply to win the king's affections. The women were being prepared to have sexual relations with the king. This is suggested by the words, "In the evening she would go there, in the morning she would return." After that, they would be transferred to another harem, which under Shashgaz, which consisted of the concubines. Most of the women were relegated to living the rest of their lives in the harem of the concubines, many probably never seeing the king again. Verse 19. Now, when the virgins were gathered together in the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows. And it was recorded in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. Another note here from the Knowledge Bible Commentary. Again, the reference to Mordecai's position at the king's gate points out that he's a judiciary official. So he actually works for the city. So he's part of the guard, and he sits at the gate. And this points to God's sovereign control over these events. Learning about a plot by Bigthana and Teresh, royal guards, to assassinate the king, Mordecai told Queen Esther, who reported it to the king. She gave credit to Mordecai for uncovering the scheme. The two men involved in the plot were hanged on the gallows, or post here. Rather than being hanged by the neck in a modern type gallows, the men were probably impaled on a stake or post. This was not an unusual method of execution in the Persian Empire. Darius Xerxes' father was known to have once impaled 3,000 men. A record of this assassination attempt was written in the annals, the official royal record. Okay, so impaling was not uncommon back then. You might remember a story of Vlad the Impaler, who later becomes, through myth and story, turns into what becomes the vampire in Transylvania, Dracula. So Vlad the Impaler did the same thing. He used to impale people on stakes. And so when they say that they were hanged in the gallows, it probably means that they were impaled on a stake for everyone to see. Let's get on to the second section. Chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gates bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. When the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of the king Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month until the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So Haman then talks to the king and talks him into allowing him to give an order to take arms against the Jews. He leaves these people nameless to the king, merely saying that they are obedient to the king's laws, these random people that are numerous throughout the kingdom. And so the king gives him the authority to write an order in the king's name. And so Haman writes an order that all the people are allowed to take arms and kill Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month. And so this becomes an edict that gets sent out. Verse 15, the couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. So again, we still have a lot of Jews that are left over. Not a lot of people went back with Zerubbabel on the first trip to back to Jerusalem, but there's still a lot of Jews that are left in both Babylon and Susa. And so this throws the people into a panic. There's a note here by the Bible Knowledge Commentary. It says, Haman, enraged by Mordecai's refusal, set out to find a way to kill all the Jews, not just Mordecai. This was an early case of anti-Semitism. In this literal plot, a climax is now reached in the tension. If the Jews were killed throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes, this would include the land of Palestine. So Zerubbabel and all the people that he took with him and their descendants, all of them would probably be killed if this order gets followed through. Chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's commanded decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. So Mordecai then informs Esther of the order and tells her that she needs to ask the king, he asked her to tell the king, but Esther responds fearfully. Just a note here on the left. We'll read in just a minute that she's fearful because you can't approach the king. You can't just approach the king without being called. And if in doing so, if he doesn't accept you, you can be killed. Let's continue on and we'll come back to the box. Verse 12, and they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think of yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have come or whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So Esther agrees to try and tell the king and asks Mordecai to have all the Jews in Susa to fast and to pray for 3 days. Getting to the note, Esther reminded Mordecai that she could not simply enter the king's inner chambers unannounced or she might be put to death. The king had the power to execute anyone who disturbed him without an appointment. For the king to extend the golden scepter to someone showed that he approved of the visit and that the person was welcome and not in danger of death. Since Esther had not been summoned by him for a month, She did not know whether his attitude toward her would be favorable. All right, so that's in a part that we skipped here. Esther hasn't seen the king in a month. He hasn't called for her in a month. So she's afraid that approaching him, that she'll enrage him and that she will be killed. And Mordecai basically points out to her, hey, if you don't do something, you're going to get killed anyway. So let's get moving on this. Excuse me. Chapter 5. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne, inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Verse 9. And when Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them all the splendor of his riches, the numbers of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above all the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then the wife of Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. So we skipped a part of the story here. I forgot to put a note. So Queen Esther invites the king and Haman to come to a feast. They go to a feast, and then she, possibly being nervous, invites them to a feast again the following day. And so that's why Haman says that he was the only one invited with the king, and he's invited again the next day. And so going off of the advice of his friends and his family, he orders a gallows or spikes to be built 50 cubits high, so that he can hang Mordecai upon it the next day. And get to the third section. Chapter 6. On that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of the memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man in whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Who would the king delight to honor more than me?" And so Haman responded to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and let the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head the royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on a horse throughout the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man in whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take these robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave nothing out that you have mentioned. Another note here from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. During the night before Esther's second banquet, Xerxes was unable to sleep. The author had not written why Esther had asked for delay before telling the king her request, but the reason was now made clear. God was going to elevate Mordecai to prepare the king to react unfavorably to Haman. So again, we see God's providence in this whole story. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman went in to feast. So this is later on that night. The king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please my king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, and I and my people to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. And the king arose in his wrath from his wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? As word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word save the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. And so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. So another note from the Bible Knowledge Commentary here. Harbona, one of the king's 7 eunuchs, told the king about the gallows which Haman had built during the previous night to kill Mordecai. Possibly Haman was hated by many people in the city of Susa, especially in government circles. Many might have been glad to see Haman killed. Chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So not only does Mordecai not get killed, Haman gets killed in his place, and Mordecai takes over Haman's position because of the king finding favor over him. So Esther then begs the king to rescind his order from Haman that the Jews can be killed on this future date on the 12th month on the 13th day. And he says that he cannot rescind his order because it has a seal, but he gives Mordecai the order to write another edict. Verse 9, the king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force and any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many of the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews for fear that the Jews had fallen on them. Another note here to the side, the edict gave the Jews the right to protect themselves and the right to annihilate and plunder any group that fought against them. The Jews could take away the property of the enemies as Mordecai had taken away the property of Haman. So, although the king will not rescind his order that Haman had given, Mordecai now gives the Jews an opportunity to arm themselves and to fight back against any that might try to destroy them. Chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews had hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. And so the people come, and the Jews destroy many of their enemies as God gives them victory. And because of that, Mordecai and Queen Esther order that all the Jews are to commemorate the following day, the 14th of Adar, and observe a celebration. Verse 24. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast pur, that is, lots, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, these days are called Purim, after the term pur. Therefore, because of all that is written in this letter, and of all that has faced them, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days occurring to what was written and at the time appointed every year. That these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. So Purim is a Jewish festival then, which commemorates the deliverance of the Jews in Persia, or in the kingdom of Persia, from Haman's evil plot against them. There's a note here that it's called Mordecai's Day in 2nd Maccabees, which takes place a couple hundred years later. But just so we understand Purim, so the word pur is, it says here, is lots. So when you cast lots, is basically like rolling dice. And so they would roll dice until they would choose, in this case, the 12th month and the 13th day. And so because the lots, or the pur, was rolled in order to figure out the day, the festival is called Purim. When we see Hebrew, and it adds im to the end of a word, it makes it plural. So Purim is plural for a lot. So lots. And that's where we get the word from. And so the festival of Purim is then ordered to be celebrated. And this gets added to the list of festivals that were given by God through Moses for the people to observe. And Jews, even to this day, continue to observe the festival of Purim. And we get to the conclusion. Chapter 10. King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastland of the sea. And all the acts of his power and might, and all the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. So one last note, this book closes by speaking of King Xerxes' power, but more importantly, it closes while extolling Mordecai, who was once a hated Jew in the Persian Empire. He was promoted by the king and revered by the Jews, and he was a great patriot because he worked so hard for them and spoke up on their behalf. As the original Jewish readers of this account would have been struck by the way God was sovereignly protecting them, often when they did not even know it, many of the things in the book of Esther happened that were beyond anyone's control except that of God, who oversees history. And the book of Esther is filled with irony, with ways in which events turned out unexpectedly in favor of God's people. A decree that would have wiped out the Jews was overruled by one which led to the destruction of nearly 76,000 enemies of the Jews. No wonder Purim was celebrated yearly and with such rejoicing, to help the Jews remember that God is in control and that the people should faithfully worship and serve their great God. And so we come to the end of Esther, and just wrapping it up, God used Esther to provide protection for the Jews living in the Persian Empire, and he used Mordecai and raised him to power so that he could lead the Jewish people well and to look out for them. And because of everything that happens in this book, they then ordered, Esther and Mordecai ordered for a festival called Purim to be established and to be recognized and celebrated annually. And the Jews continue to do that to this day. So if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. Please post below. Thank you for your time and have a great night.